Grandpa's Journal, Episode 4, The Offering. The incident with the rascally rodents had stirred me past the point of sleep, and it was way too cold to loiter long without starting a fire in the stove. I dressed quickly and peered out the window to the east. The sun had just begun to rise on another beautiful fall day, the first full day in my newly adopted homeland. The rising sun was just a sliver on the eastern horizon. The carriage house sits within a stone's throw of the edge of the bluff, but the river valley that was there yesterday was nowhere in sight. The valley, from the edge of the house to the top of the eastern ridge half a mile away, was full to level with a swirling sea of gradually receding fog. The shaded areas in the yard were sparkling with a light coat of frost, and the areas where the first rays of sun shone were steaming with their newfound warmth. As the fog dissipated and the vapors rose from the turbulent sea of mist, they caught the sunlight and burst into dazzling displays of shimmering rainbows. By pressing my face against the window frame, I could just see the edge of Uncle Gus's cabin at the northeast end of Camp House. A coal oil lamp burned cheerfully in the window, and billowy wisps of smoke boiled from the stovepipe and rose undisturbed through the crisp morning air. Christoph was still sound asleep. I closed the door quietly behind me and found a well-used trail that meandered through the wild azaleas that grew along the bluff. A group of cedar waxwings passed fall berries along the dogwood limbs, and nuthatches chattered noisily as they scrambled up and down the tree trunks in search of breakfast. As I reached the porch of the cabin, I wiped my feet and peeked in through the lightly frosted window pane. Uncle Gus was sitting in his rocker by the wood range, and a more elderly gentleman was warming his backside by the crackling fire. Both smiled as I approached, and Uncle Gus motioned for me to enter. My uncle introduced me to Argyle McGregor, who greeted me with a warm handshake and a thick Scottish accent, which, despite my best efforts, caused me to break into a big, foolish grin. Following introductions, Uncle Gus and Mr. McGregor returned to their discussion, and it was soon apparent that their topic of conversation was an unfortunate event. Evidently there had been an accident at a mine up north several days earlier, and a local man by the name of Kenny had been killed. The man leaves behind a wife and 12 children who live in the Irish community which we'd passed the previous day. The family was left with little means of support, and winter fast approaching. Uncle Gus and Argyle were planning to provide the family with provisions which they intended to deliver immediately following breakfast. My uncle invited me to go along, and I readily accepted his invitation. A knock at the door connecting the log cabin to the main house proved to be Cousin Klaus, who rises early every morning in order to accommodate the long drive to town and have the shoe shop open for business by 8 o'clock. After hearing our plans, he promptly disappeared, returning momentarily with a splendid navy blue pea jacket. "This was mine," he said, handing the heavy wool affair to me and patting his belly. "I think it shrank. If you're going to venture out with these two characters, you'd better dress the part." I broke out in another silly grin as Klaus helped me into the bulky woolen garment. "That's better," exclaimed Klaus. "Now you look like a rip-roaring, sea-going son of a sea cook for sure." The pea coat was a little big for me, but it was warm, and his kind gesture caught me a little off guard. I wasn't sure what to say, but I was sincerely delighted with the generous gift, and I grabbed his huge, calloused hand and gave it a big squeeze. "Easy there, mate," he said, feigning a grimace, and then went to grinning like a cat in a cream can. Cousin Irving was up also, and had already gone to the field to begin a long day of farm work. Within half an hour, no one else had stirred, and Uncle Gus said he was inclined to just let them sleep in. The four of us enjoyed toast, coffee, and soft-boiled eggs, which Uncle Gus prepared in the cabin, and we were soon underway. Cousin Klaus mounted the dapple-gray Belgian, bid us adieu, and headed off for the shoe shop. Mr. McGregor was driving a small buckboard, and had provided an enormous tom turkey, which lay hobbled in the back. We loaded 2 sacks of whole wheat flour and a bushel basket of fresh picked sweet corn. Uncle Gus and Mr. McGregor climbed into the driver's seat, and I was drafted into active duty and assigned the formidable task of squatting cross-legged in the back of the jolting buggy and supervising the bird. The 30-pound gulper proved to be amicable enough as long as the ride was smooth, but every time we hit a rut, the turkey would gobble frantically and flog the fire out of me with his powerful wings. The ride to town was long and memorable, but nothing I'd choose to repeat. I spat dust and feathers the entire trip, and the poor disheveled turkey was absolutely livid. After what seemed an eternity, we arrived at Paddy Creek. This particular Irish community was home to about 15 poverty-stricken families. The majority of the homes were small, poorly built wood frame structures, which offered little protection from the elements under even the best conditions. The families were mostly recent immigrants from Ireland, and those members of the community who'd arrived earlier and now considered themselves natives had received these hungry newcomers with what we'll charitably call a dubious enthusiasm. It's the nature of humans and mangy dogs to grab their bone and growl when approached by strangers. These pilgrims from the Emerald Isle were, for the most part, fine, upstanding Christian folk, but they'd arrived in this country with little or nothing, and most of that was gone. The men who were able eked out a meager living in the coal mines up north, and the women struggled to survive by taking in laundry and seamstress work, along with arduous daily responsibilities inherent in tending to the needs of large numbers of children. Health care was all but non-existent, and the Grim Reaper was a visitor they knew all too well. The Kinney home was a rustic affair, terraced into a steep, rocky bank. There was a small, well-tended plot of ground where the family evidently attempted to produce vegetables, but the reward for their efforts almost certainly made their homeland's rapidly worsening potato famine look like a cornucopia. A veritable web of clotheslines surrounded the weathered house, each one waving a generous variety of well-worn linens and badly frayed overalls. In the yard, a Yorkshire sow spread herself contentedly in the luxurious sun, as a gaggle of diaper-clad toddlers mingled with the old sow's litter and played king of the mountain on an overturned washtub. The porch was home to a threadbare sofa, and half a dozen bantam chickens sunned and preened themselves along the railing. As we climbed the rickety stairs, a 12-year-old boy came to the door and introduced himself as Lidge Timothy Kinney III. His mother had taken to her bed, but he'd fetch his aunt. Mrs. O'Mara was probably about 40, but the years had not been kind. She forced her worry-worn face into a weary but pleasant smile and asked what she could do for us. Mr. McGregor took her by the work-withered hand and explained why we'd come. Her tired eyes welled up with tears, and she quivered with a restrained sob. "Please wait here," she said. In a moment she returned, assisting Mrs. Kinney. The old woman took Uncle Gus's hand in both of hers and stared appreciatively into his sympathetic face. Tears streamed down her furrowed cheeks as she bit her trembling lip and sighed. "God bless you," she said, and was overcome with grief. Mr. McGregor and I excused ourselves and began unloading the provisions. Earlier in the day, the provisions had seemed to me a more than ample gift. Now, somehow, they seemed very small indeed. Lige locked the turkey into the chicken house, and we carried the rest of our offering through the meager kitchen into a small, almost empty pantry. Mrs. Kinney's eldest daughter, Laura, was doing dishes, and 10-year-old Mariah stood clutching her apron and wiping her lustrous brown eyes. As I sat a sack of flour down by the dry sink, Mariah's eyes momentarily fixed on mine. Both of us blushed and glanced immediately away, but somewhere in the cosmos the connection was already made. As I arose, I involuntarily offered my hand. Mariah seized it eagerly, drew me tenderly to her side, and the two of us joined unexpectedly in embrace. She sobbed quietly for a moment, her fragile form quivering against my chest, And then those huge brown eyes gazed once again into mine. "We can't thank you enough," she said, in a tiny trembling voice. "Papa's gone, and Mama's heart is broke." I squeezed her hand and tried to force a smile, but she'd touched me too deeply. The smile wouldn't come. I bent down, kissing her gently on the forehead, and Uncle Gus laid his hand on my shoulder and said compassionately, "Come along, Obadiah. Let's go home."